Hello everyone, and you're all very welcome to the new series of our Client Experience webinar programme. We're delighted that you've chosen to join us today. My name is Niamh O'Connor and I'm part of the Client Experience programme team here at Dentons. Whether it's your very first time joining us or you've been with us right from the very start, you are joining over 2,000 General Counsel and in-house legal team members around the world who've registered for our current series. Shaped by the input of this community, this programme continues to be focused on bringing you practical insights on some of the most topical issues facing you and your in-house legal team. As always, these sessions are all about you. We are really keen for you to get the most value out of it in terms of practical takeaways. So I encourage you to make the most out of the chat and the messaging function as we work through today's discussion. Today's session is the first of 7 sessions in the current series, which will take place between now and March 2025. So without further ado, I'm very excited to hand you over to my colleague at Dentons, Pamela Shen, who will introduce you to our panel and take you through today's discussion. We hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Niamh, and thank you everyone for making time to join us today. I'm Pamela Shen, and I'm a partner in Dentons Toronto Tax Group, and I lead the firm's charity and nonprofit law practice. I've had the pleasure of serving as in-house counsel and the privilege of advising boards. And I'm excited to introduce to you a number of Dentons colleagues, all former general counsel and board members, who bring a very rich experience to today's important discussion. Stephanie, let's turn to you first.
Hello, my name is Stephanie Aberton, and I am counsel at Dentons, split between Washington, D.C. and New York, officially in the litigation group. Prior to joining Dentons a little over a year ago, I had more than a 25-year career in-house, most recently as general counsel and corporate secretary, among other things, at a media startup, which I joined prior to launch, and which we sold in the summer of 2022. And before that, I was at a number of different companies, primarily either large publicly traded companies or subsidiaries of publicly traded companies, where I served as either a senior lawyer who was supporting the general counsel, as I understand a number of people on the call are today, or where I served as effectively the board advisor and GC for individual subsidiaries. I've also served on and advised a number of nonprofit boards and have found all of those experiences to be very similar in some ways and very different in others. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of the lessons with you all today.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Next, let's turn to Nadia to outline her experience.
Hi, everybody. It's great to join you today. My name is Nadia Johnson. I am a English corporate M&A partner, but I'm based in the Dentons Istanbul office. I've had 2 forays into the general counsel world prior to joining Dentons 6 years ago. The first of which was a general counsel position for a media division of a US entity that was based in Russia, the former Soviet Union, the Far East, and also we had operations in India. So that was very diverse. And I was appointed as a new sort of global role for that particular division. So it was sort of a position I was able to shape it really from the start. And then more latterly, I was general counsel and company secretary for an oil and gas company that was listed on the London Stock Exchange, but had operations in Russia and Ukraine. So very different experiences, but also experiences actually that are quite relevant to also working as a partner in this role. So I'm very pleased to share that with you today.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And we're also delighted to be joined by Kate Brower, who many of you know well from our client experience and WOW programs. Kate will input from an inclusion and diversity perspective. Kate, please, we welcome you to introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Pamela, and it's great to be with everyone again. And hello to those I've met before, and I'm delighted to be introduced to those of you who I've not met before. Again, my name is Kate Brower. I'm the Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity Officer here at Dentons. I happen to be based in Canada, but I support and work with our teams all over the world. And I've also worked with many general counsels over the years in this context and in others. For the purposes of this session, I'd say the important factual element is that I sit on and I advise our global board here at Dentons, providing them with guidance around inclusion, diversity, and equity issues and beyond. So I'm delighted to join the conversation today. Thanks very much, Pamela.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone. What a distinguished panel we have today, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to gaining insights from them. We'll also have some poll questions throughout the session, so we are looking forward to gaining your insights as well as we engage together. We've structured today's session into 3 core areas. First, we'll go over the role of General Counsel. Then we'll go through some of the challenges around navigating change in the Office of the General Counsel and how you operate within your organizations through those changes. And then lastly, we'll go through balancing conflicting stakeholder priorities. We're also going to have a Q&A session at the end. If you have questions, please feel free to use the chat function to include your questions, and we'll get to them towards the end of our session today. So without further ado, we'll start with our first topic around the role of the General Counsel at the board. And we'll turn to Nadia first. And, obviously, Nadia, you can take this in so many different directions with this big and broad question around what is the role of General Counsel? We'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I think the short answer to that is that it's a bit of a balancing act, frankly. And I think it's helpful to consider that role from 2 perspectives. First of all, an operational perspective, and then also what that means sort of from a corporate governance perspective. The 2 are very much interlinked, but I think it's a good way to sort of break it down into some sort of bite-sized pieces. And I think when we consider that role of General Counsel, it's always, against the backdrop that whilst you're trying to perform your function as GC, there is a real live business that's got needs and demands that need to be met and managed on a daily, sometimes hourly, depending what's going on basis. So it's really quite a tough path to navigate at times. I think the first thing operationally, if we consider those aspects, first of all, I think number 1, above everything else, it's really important to understand the business. So if you're coming in and you're new to that role, it's critical that you sort of embed yourself with your colleagues, with the management, with the board, but with the day-to-day operations of what's going on. So depending on where you're sat physically, I think it's important to get up. You walk the floor, you introduce yourself to people, you get to know people. You make site visits when those opportunities are given to you. And if there is an opportunity to travel with the business teams, then you take those opportunities and you embrace them wholly. And in fact, if you need to be pushy about being included, whether it's a budget meeting or an early negotiation meeting, then I think that's really good advice to follow, because it will give you a full, proper oversight on how things really work and what the dynamics are between senior management and the day-to-day employees in the business who are going to call on you for help when they need it. Then I think you need to internally manage your team. And when I talk about sort of your internal team, you may inherit an existing legal team, in which case you need to understand how that functions and who has the requisite legal expertise to serve the various divisions within the business. But also around that piece of your internal legal team, you need to understand who your external legal advisors are, so that you know when to call upon, who to call if there is a big issue and you need that immediate help, and how they interact with your legal team. And also, very importantly, because you're reporting to the board, how those costs are going to be managed, because legal is a line item on the budget and it's a cost center. So you've got to make sure that you are working efficiently with your internal legal team. And I think if you are growing a legal team from scratch, if you have been out to the business to see what the needs are, where the operations are, then it's a good basis then to come back and justify to whoever it is who's signing off on your budget, look, I need this support in this particular location. And once you've got your team there, I think it's important that they are included if there are site visits, if there are meetings, if there is an opportunity to travel, go out and sit with the legal team wherever it is and understand locally what is going on so that you can report back to the board essentially. And on that, then I think sort of the third thing is you need to act as the filter, because ultimately, you know, you will be the one probably out of all of the legal team that has to go to the board meeting and has to, probably about 2 minutes to answer questions about, will you do this acquisition? Are we going to do this investment? What are the key issues arising out of this due diligence report? So if you can really understand what's going on at an operational level, that means that the advice that you're giving to the board who need to take the high level decisions is going to be succinct and relevant to whatever it is that's on the table. And it cuts out a lot of the perhaps unnecessary back and forth between board and middle management. So I think those are key issues on the operational side. Then I think if you look at the governance side, I mean, of course, everybody expects you, as I discovered twice, very differently, to be an expert on all things in quite possibly all jurisdictions. So, and of course you can't be, but if you've got a good legal internal team and you're using your external legal function properly, then you can really get to know your stuff. And I think that's, you know, top governance rule is like, it is expected that you know what you're talking about, you know what the rules are, you know what the regulations are, you know how the business is supposed to be complying with, you know, whether it's modern slavery, whether it's the Bribery Act, whether it's FCPA, all of that's a given. And you need to know what the current rules are, but also be able to at least anticipate or predict, and if necessary, take advice on where certain rules and regulations may be going, because that can also have an impact on the business. So being proactive in terms of knowing your legal stuff, I think is really, really critical. I think the other thing is you've got to be prepared. So that means that you have to prepare yourself as general counsel. So if you're going to a meeting, you need to know what the issues are that are going to come up. You need to have taken advice either from the operational team or from your internal team, or if necessary, your external legal advisor. But there's nothing worse than being in a board meeting and somebody fires a question at you and you're kind of the rabbit in the headlights and you don't have those answers at hand. Sometimes that will happen, inevitably it does. But I think for those of you who are British and you've been a Girl Guide, you know, be prepared is one of the mottos. And I think that stands you in good stake. I think it's also good to help your board to be prepared. So if they are going to come to meetings, you need to help them, because if you're sitting on a PLC board, for example, you're going to have independent directors. They turn up perhaps 4 times a year. They're not so close to the operational aspects of the business. So, you know, typically it would be, you know, the role of the GC to help put together the board packs. So you need to give them the information, to feed them the information, feed them the legal background that's going to need to be discussed at whatever the next meeting is. And then I think being available to those board members in particular and soliciting questions from them if it's in advance of that meeting, I think that's also helpful. So if you say to somebody, look, there's this issue, if you've got any questions, let me know, we can discuss it in advance. Do you need more information prior to turning up at the meeting? I think that's a really good way to show that you're adding value as a GC and that you're trying to be a facilitator and to act in a commercially pragmatic way and help these people. I think that when you are then in the meetings and if there's a decision to be made, it's extremely important that you remain in that sort of position. And it's a really hard balance sometimes to remain impartial, because at the end of the day, you've got a lot of different people asking you different questions. And I think that it's critical to grow trust, and both with the board, but also with your operational team, to show that you're not sort of batting for one side over another. So the role of the GC is to stand firm, basically, to understand that when they are on, you're on firm ground, and whatever you say to back that up with proper advice and be on in a firm legal position. And I think that understanding as well where you need to have a few sort of perhaps set phrases to deliver difficult messages, but the bottom line, if it's no, there is a nicer way to say no that's a more measured way, perhaps, which reflects all of the advice that has been taken on, that shows there's some appreciation for what the different viewpoints may be. But being able to say no, but from a firm legal position, is absolutely critical. That, and also perhaps also at times you may have to even recuse yourself from a discussion because you need to retain that impartiality. And I think it's something that you develop over time. And I think that if you can combine that with the fact that you are supposed to be the legal expert and show good value for whatever the advice is that you're delivering, I think that can really help foster some good relationships within the boards that you're asked to serve as a GC.
Thank you so much, Nadia. There's so many amazing nuggets of wisdom there, and I'm sure we'll be able to kind of pull the threads on some of those comments you've made in our discussion as we continue on. And I thought it would be helpful for us to have a quick poll question just to get a sense of who we have in the room. So I'm going to hand it over to Niamh to walk us through our first poll question today.
So as always, we love to get input from everyone today. The question we have for you first is, what is the most challenging aspect of engaging with the board in your role as General Counsel? Maybe it's anticipating evolving legal and regulatory landscapes. Maybe it's that legal compliance while supporting business priorities. Maybe it's providing unbiased legal advice while also at the same time managing internal politics and expectations. Maybe it's clarity around the specific role you have in the board setting. The expectation, Nadia mentioned it, that you're an expert on every legal matter in every jurisdiction. Maybe it's handling crises, or perhaps it's more on the legal function side, operating with limited resources and budgets. Or maybe it's something else entirely. And if it is, pop us a note in the chat, because we are keen that we align this accurately with your views. So lovely to see loads of people getting involved. So we're going to give maybe 5 more seconds. We'll do a short countdown. So let's go 5, 4, 3, 2. Lots of last minute votes coming in. 1. And we will now close the poll. I can still see the numbers going up. So let's close the poll and share the results with you all. Okay, so quite interesting, Pamela, this time. So we have a mix between ensuring legal compliance while that balance with supporting business priorities. The unbiased legal advice while also managing, so it is a balancing act coming in here, managing internal politics and expectations. And it's as Nadia mentioned, it's this expectation that you're an expert on every legal matter. And I'm also seeing at 16% operating with limited resources and budget. So quite a number of challenges coming to the top of that poll, which is quite interesting. So back to the panel to discuss.
Thank you so much, Niamh, and thank you everyone for participating. 62% participation is excellent, and we know we have an engaged audience today, so there'll be a couple more questions as we go. We're looking forward to receiving more insights from you. And it looks like this comment that Nadia made around wearing many hats, and that's obviously showing through these poll results, just all of the different things we need to prioritize, making sure that there's that expectation that we're meeting, whether that's ourselves or through resources that are available to us, to have expertise on different legal matters, and then of course providing the unbiased advice. So I'm going to ask our next panelist, Stephanie, to weigh in on this question around how do you balance your responsibilities as a lawyer with your responsibilities as an executive?
Thanks, Pam. I think this is a question that if you're lucky enough to work in a company where lawyers are understood and considered to be partners of the business can be one of the most challenging things. But it also can lead to a more rewarding and more successful GC role. At the end of the day, the general counsel really has two hats to wear. You're a senior executive in the company, and your fundamental role and your fundamental job is to support the business and help the business be as successful as you possibly can. At the same time, often you are expected to be the person who raises the stop sign and who asks the hard questions, or who, to refer to something someone raised in the chat, who forces the board and your co-executives to focus on the harder issues that are less fun and the things people maybe don't want to think about. One from my life over the past 10 years has been privacy. I'm sure it's everyone else's life in this room as well. And so you also have to remember that you are leading a team, often, if you're fortunate, a large team, who the day-to-day employees in the business also rely on to be their steady hand and their check and their advisor and their guidepost. And so the way that I always recommend that people approach this situation is to really understand in any given situation who the client is, not at a high level, it's always the company, but who is the person that you as a lawyer need to guide into doing what in any given situation. And if it's in a board scenario, it's the board, but it also might be the employee who knocks on your door who has a question. And in order to do all of those things, and this is going to be a recurring theme today, you have to know the business. And you as the general counsel cannot provide effective support to the business unless you know the business as well as every other executive who also have different responsibilities. And so if you are taking on a new role at a new company, if you are taking on a new role in a new industry, start to read the trades, start to listen to podcasts, start to get to know all of the challenges that each of the individuals in the company who work on the operational side are actually facing. And that will position you to understand and be able to see around the corners the board is expecting you to see around. And lastly, understand the background of the board members, because everyone, if you are fortunate enough to have a good board, then everyone in that room has a different background and a different perspective. And without knowing what those are, it will be very hard for you to navigate through giving them the best advice in the way that is going to be their reference point and be successful and show your value to them. And the other thing is that I'll just add, which I'm sure is going to come up multiple times, is remember that as the lawyer, it is ultimately your job to be the calm, steady hand for the business. Whatever is going on, people will always look to you to be the calm, steady hand. If you as the lawyer are in a panic, then everyone is in trouble.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I think that's a great, just, one phrase, calm, steady hand, and imagining yourself as that person. And I think that's a great kind of visual image, even just, in times of crises or in calmer times. Thank you for that and for your comments. We're going to move now to another poll question, and then we'll invite Kate to weigh in from an ID&E perspective. So the next poll question, Niamh, if you could please walk us through that, and we'd love to see your insights.
So the second question we have for everyone is, which of the following areas would you most like to focus on to increase your impact with the board? Is it positioning yourself as a commercial business leader, not just a legal advisor? Elevating the importance of anticipating and managing risk? Maybe it's building stronger relationships with board members, leading on board governance and effectiveness. Perhaps it's being a trusted advisor on risk and ethical decision making, or being a key stakeholder in evolving and emerging areas like AI and ESG, or perhaps it's something else entirely. So if it is, let us know in the chat now. So again, it's lovely to see lots of engagement, numbers going up. Let's do a short countdown. Let's go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on this one. Excellent. Still some votes coming in. So we'll just give 2 more seconds. We will end the poll and share the results with you all now. So this one is a little clearer for the panel. So really positioning as a commercial business leader and not just a legal advisor. So quite a level of consensus on that one at 36%. So I'll hand it back, Pamela, to you and the team to work that through the discussion.
This is great timing, I think, because our next speaker is on this very topic around how do you position yourself as a commercial business leader, not just a legal advisor. I'm going to hand it over to Kate to share with us some ideas on where inclusion, diversity, and equity fit into the role of the General Counsel.
Thanks very much, Pamela, and thanks to all for your answers to that poll. I actually, maybe I'm not surprised about the answer around a commercial business advisor. I think that is a desire of many, but I was also very intrigued by the array and the number of people who pointed to risk issues, ethics, board effectiveness, governance. And what I really want to do is talk about inclusion, diversity, and equity as an enabler of all of those important things that sit within the wheelhouse of the General Counsel or the legal function. So I'll just off the top say, because I think it's important to acknowledge, of course, you're going to be concerned about ensuring that your board is meeting any legal and regulatory obligations that you may have around board diversity. Of course, there are many different aspects of that can apply in different parts of the world. That's just foundational. What I really want to talk about is what I will call that enabler. So assuming, and I think this would be the case for all, of course, in your organizations, that the ultimate objective is to have a high-performing board, what we know and what the evidence and research has shown us, and it is a tricky one, to research and find evidence around because of the importance of board confidentiality in boards, and actually getting into the meat of what happens in boardrooms. But what we do know from some fairly robust quantitative and qualitative research is that more diverse, and I will say, and underline bold, inclusive boards have been shown to be very beneficial in achieving many of the board objectives and the objectives that you pointed to. For example, more inclusive boards where there are those diverse perspectives in the room. And when we talk about diversity, we're talking about different geographies, different professional experience, different backgrounds. Sometimes, different backgrounds means people come in many different packages. Gender diversity, of course, there's been a great deal of research around that. But when boards are more diverse and inclusive, it has been shown that they can be better at managing risk. They're more effective in adhering to and focusing on governance and oversight matters. And they can also reduce the risk of what we call groupthink, a word that people may have heard before, but this is when we get groups of people in rooms that have great similarities in backgrounds, and they don't necessarily see what a more diverse group would in terms of potential risks and challenges. Why is this the case? Well, the diversity of perspective and inclusion has been shown to lead to more robust discussion, obviously different perspectives being brought to bear. These are the sorts of things that have been credited with the outcomes that I've just described. So you might see more questioning and in-depth analysis of issues. That often happens with a board then taking greater care in their decision-making process. But I will, again, double-click on and highlight the really critical focus needs to be on, once you have that diversity, inclusion in the boardroom, because without an inclusive approach where all of the perspectives are being invited into the conversation and creating that culture in the boardroom, you really won't see the value that can be added from the diversity of perspective. There are lots of practical strategies that can be applied to optimize those board discussions from an inclusion, diversity, and equity perspective. But I'll leave it at that for the moment and hand it back to Pamela, and maybe we can get to some of those later on in the conversation.
Thanks so much, Kate. I hope we can as well. And we're going to move on to our next topic on navigating change. And, you know, they say the one constant in our lives is change. And that couldn't be more true about the legal function and all of the changes, and even just in regulatory landscapes. So I'm going to hand it over actually to Stephanie now. How do you balance your role as GC and executive leader when it comes to leading or inputting to change projects?
Thanks, Pam. This is a question that I think actually feeds into the poll response, because at the end of the day, the hardest part about dealing with change and leading through change is that often the legal viewpoint might conflict with the viewpoint of other stakeholders. And so the first thing that I suggest is that it's much easier if you have done the groundwork in advance to be viewed as a business partner and a business leader. And one of the things that everybody, sort of raises, well, how do we do that? On the one hand, the general counsel is supposed to be the person who helps the enterprise manage risk, who throws up red flags when people are on a pathway that could cause issues, making sure everybody dots their I's and crosses their T's when it comes to governance. At the same time, if that's all you do, and if that's all you view your role as, then no one will want to come talk to you, because you will constantly be the person who gets in the way of whatever it is that the particular business leader wants to do, or the board wants to do, or whatnot. And so as a starting point, think about how you frame your advice, and think about how you respond to a question. We're all lawyers. We have all spent most of our career dealing with words. There are lots of ways to say no without actually saying no. And that is a skill that is very, very important to perfect, especially when dealing with board members and other executives who might not be used to being told no, and who might not necessarily take it very well. And if you find ways to provide constructive alternatives or constructive advice on how to achieve the business goals in the context of saying no, eventually, hopefully, you will be viewed as a partner who is helping them achieve their business goals while minimizing risk, rather than the partner who's always raising questions about risk. And if you're managing through change, that is particularly important, because everybody is going to be nervous and unsettled. And you have to identify who your constituents are, and there will be many of them. You will have the board, you will have executives, you will have a team that is all in themselves nervous. And this goes back to, again, making sure that you offer a steady hand, and making sure that you identify when you believe you are adding value as a business leader as opposed to a lawyer. And you shouldn't hesitate to do that, but you should be really clear when you're speaking as just another executive voice in the room who's leading a team in this organization that is going to be dealing with all of this change, versus when you're a lawyer and they feel they have to listen to you in a different way. And when you do all of that, if you sort of clarify and understand what you're doing, ultimately the goal would be to be working together as a partner with everybody, and to be able to navigate that line between the legal side, we really shouldn't do this, or we really shouldn't do this way, or we really should take this approach, and the business side, which is, I understand the goals we need to achieve, I understand how we need to get there, and here's my thoughts on how we as the legal department can contribute and support that, and how I can contribute and support that. And those two things together hopefully will position you to be the rational voice in the room when maybe not everybody else is rational, because their things are constantly changing around them.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I think we've heard so much about stakeholders today and partnering in a different way with, folks with different perspectives and priorities. And so on that note, we're going to move to our final topic around balancing the interests of stakeholders with different responsibilities and priorities. And we'll go first to Nadia on this. What advice would you have for our audience on handling conflict scenarios with other stakeholders at the board table?
I mean, I'm just looking at one of the comments, which is that if some business people assume that because you're calm, you're not taking it seriously. And I think, and Stephanie's also said, that you need to stay calm. I think that's absolutely right, that if there is an internal conflict between, it could be members of the board themselves. I mean, we see that a lot when there's basically a fight around the board table, particularly when in listed entities where you may have very different sort of stakeholder interests and groups. But also obviously within business teams and between business development teams and perhaps the legal team. So I think, being calm is critical to that path. I also think that, yes, you have to choose words carefully. Words have meaning. And I think there are certain ways in which to say something. And I think that if the board has bought into the fact that you're actually trying to be helpful and be a proactive, commercially minded business leader, sometimes, you saying no can be incredibly effective, because if you rarely say no, then the meaning behind those words when you do use them can sort of deliver meaning that perhaps 1,000 words cannot. So I think that there's always that balance. But I think you've got to try to frame, if there's going to be if that conflict is taking place in a meeting scenario, I think that you can be prepared for that, right? You can help frame that discussion in such a way by having perhaps a detailed agenda of what it is that you really need to discuss and what are the different viewpoints on that particular topic that are going to be tabled at that meeting for discussion. And that could really help frame that conversation towards some sort of outcome or resolution that can actually be implemented post the meeting. That's fine if you're dealing with that in a meeting scenario, but let's face it, it's not always like that. It's quite often, on the hoof. So I think that you need to be able to listen. Like, I spent a lot of time listening and not speaking, which I talk a lot. So to actually sit quietly and to listen, I think that's a really important skill, so that you hear both sides of whatever the debate is, but then that you are prepared with your responses and your legal advice to be able to answer the questions that are coming at you from whether it's the business development team or the manager or the legal director in whatever jurisdiction it is that you're talking about. I think that's important. And I think there have been times when I've been in a conflict scenario where, being able to lean on your external counsel is invaluable, actually, because then that it's almost as if, sometimes if they don't want to hear it from you, perhaps as the board members or the senior exec, but if they hear it from, the external advisor, that we only pull in when we're having, a difficult moment, then I think that can be impactful. Now, of course, you have to balance that always. There's the cost benefit analysis around that, and you can't be dialing a friend all the time. That's not how good management should work. But I think knowing that if there is something that's coming up that's tricky, and let's say you've tried it a few times and you're not getting anywhere, but actually you need to, let's just take this outside of the whole sort of internal perspective and get a completely objective outlook on things, that can be quite helpful and impactful. But I think that there's no right way or wrong way to do it. And I think it's good to stay calm. And I appreciate the comment about how, especially if you're working in different jurisdictions where everybody's sort of impression of how you're dealing with a scenario might be very different, because culturally things are different. I think that being able to sort of to dial it down and to keep the key issues at play and to try to filter out some of the noise perhaps when people are very impassioned about what it is that they are trying to achieve is incredibly important. And again, it's going to be a balancing act. And sometimes those conflicts, they don't get resolved in the first time round, the second time round, and they keep popping up. And you just have to approach each one, I think, independently and slightly differently. And that comes, you have to be able to do that, I think, effectively. You've got to understand what's going on, because if you're just coming at it sort of blind, as it were, then I don't think that's really helpful to the organization, and that's not adding value in terms of your line item in the budget.
That's great. And then sometimes things do tend to escalate to a crisis. So Stephanie, any advice from your end on what you would do when a scenario escalates to a crisis?
Sure. Thank you. A couple things. First, picking up on what Nadia said, I think, and this goes back to one of the poll questions, which is the first thing is to understand what resources are available to you as the general counsel. It might be external counsel, it might be people on your own team, it might be subject matter experts in the business, it might be a board member, it might even be an independent board member who doesn't, who shows up once, every 4 years, but happens to have personal experience in this particular type of crisis. But figuring out what resources are available to you, because while it is easy to say that we're always expected to be the expert on everything, we all know that we're not the expert on everything. But you can't be in a crisis and answer, I don't know, and I don't know what to do. And so making sure that you know who to call, where, when, and how. And this is a moment where it also is, I think, helpful to identify who the phone a friend is. And it may be an external lawyer who's been in your shoes. It may be a trusted advisor who you've worked with for many years. It may be just one other executive in the company who you have a particularly good relationship with, who you can use as a sounding board. But ultimately, know what your resources are. The second thing is know who your constituents are and who the most important constituents for the company is. When I worked in sort of large publicly traded companies, the first thing we thought about in any crisis was the communications and PR side of things. And I was trained very early on in my professional career that we don't comment on pending legal issues or we're investigating was not an acceptable response for the lawyer. So I worked really closely with our communications team to figure out what we could say that fulfilled their needs, but that didn't cause a legal issue. And sometimes we involved outside counsel in that, and sometimes we did not. But we always worked together to make sure that we were all had the same message. And we also thought about the fact that it's really important in a crisis to think about your employees, not just the members of the legal department who probably have their phones ringing off the hook from other people in the company trying to find out what's going on or what their issues are, whether they have anything to worry about, but anybody else. And if you as the lawyer can be in a place where you are the steady, rational, impartial hand who can help each aspect of the company and each person in the company who's trying to manage some piece of this crisis, do so consistently and achieve whatever their goal is or has to be for the business in the crisis, in a way that minimizes the legal risk, you will have done a wonderful thing. And so that goes back to my two steady North Stars for this conversation generally, which are you have to know the business in order to be able to do that. And you have to have built relationships of trust with the people that you're dealing with in a crisis situation for them to rely on you, or they are, as someone in the chat just noted, they're all going to pick up the phone and call their friends who are lawyers or their outside lawyer to be a check on you. And so you really want to have built up those relationships prior to there being a crisis. And you want to know enough about the business to know not just what legal risks the crisis poses, but what business risks the crisis poses, so that you can help manage the legal risks in a way that is in parallel with managing the business risks and not in conflict with managing the business risks. And that may be spending a lot of your time visiting with other fellow executives. It may be, I came out of the entertainment industry, so it may be having a lot of lunches with your coworkers where you just get to know them outside of the crisis situation. And if you do that, then you will be best positioned to serve the importance of the general counsel role in the crisis, as well as being a partner and executive in the business.
Love that. I picture it as, you know, being in-house counsel means you still have to do some business development as well. And there is that kind of networking component absolutely important in that role, which I'm sure our audience knows very well today.
Can I just jump in there? Sorry, Pamela, just to respond to something Stephanie said, because I'm also reading the things in the chat. I mean, I think that, and you asked me about how do you manage conflict. I think that anticipating when that conflict is going to escalate to a crisis is something that you need to develop, I think, as a GC, and you can probably spot it. And so that if you're prepared and you start delivering the messages around internally to whoever it is that's sort of who's in dispute early on, I think that's helpful. And I think that bringing in the external counsel, I think there was a comment about people not listening to external or internal counsel because they prefer the external counsel. I think that it's not to say like, oh, so-and-so at XYZ law firm said this. I think that when you're giving your advice, if you work in, because if you're getting to a crisis, you will have been taking some external legal advice, particularly if you're, you know, a listed entity and you've got to manage, as Stephanie said, the communication around that. So building in that external advice to the advice that you're giving internally initially, I think can be helpful, because it is hard sometimes to sort of walk in and say, this is how we're going to manage it, because people will be like, well, you know, I'm going to call my friend who's a partner here, or so-and-so who works here. And I think that if you've sort of laid the groundwork early on, because this crisis is going to be building probably, that can be a helpful way to approach things.
Thanks so much.
Sorry about that.
I do want to bring us into the discussion with Kate, though, because she actually has to drop off soon. So if I could just ask you, Stephanie, to hold your comments just for a minute here. We will get into our Q&A. But before, Kate, you have to leave, I'll just ask you, can you talk about conflict from an ID&E perspective? And if you could give us 2 or 3 practical kind of tips for how to encourage more robust conversations in that space.
Thanks very much, Pamela, and my apologies to all. As you can see, I've got my Inclusion Month banner behind me, and I am going to have to drop a little bit early to join some sessions that we're running internally at Dentons for that in a moment, but very happy to have questions offline as needed. Just a couple of things. You know, we've been talking about conflict, and I just want to highlight that in the inclusion, diversity, and equity perspective, yes, there's always bad conflict. We don't want people who are disrespectful. We don't want circumstances where we're maybe drifting into, you know, feelings of bullying and so on and so forth. But conflict is good from an inclusion, diversity, and equity perspective. I talked earlier about wanting to get all those perspectives in the room and inclusion. And the reason it works is because you have conflict. You have people, you want people to potentially disagree, to be questioning conclusions, just to be testing and, you know, as we say, kicking the tires on decision making. So you want to bring that good conflict into the conversation. Now, I'm often asked, well, how do you do that effectively? Right? What we're really trying to do is we're trying to generate dialogue. We're trying to encourage people in the room to ask questions, and we're trying to encourage people to contribute their viewpoint as part of that robust, inclusive culture we talked about. So just a couple of tips that, you know, I have talked to your board chair. talk to them about how they're running their meeting. Encourage them to invite people into the conversation. There's no point in having people in the room with a different perspective if they're not speaking up and sharing that. So a board chair can be really effective in inviting them. And I would say ask people proactively to contribute opposing viewpoints. We do it a lot here. We'll be having a conversation we will invite people in the room to say, does somebody have a different viewpoint, an opposing view? Are there any concerns that people have with what we're talking about? We really want to air those now rather than having to encounter challenges that we can see in this room but aren't being articulated down the line. So all to say, good conflict is something that you really want to generate in your conversations. And with that, Pamela, I'll hand it back to you, and I will make my excuses and thank the group. And please do send any questions along to me.
Thanks, Kate. Good luck with the Inclusion Month sessions ahead. Great. So Stephanie, I'll go back to you to close out on your comment, and then we'll open it up to the group for Q&A. And I do see there's a number of questions coming through. Whatever we don't get to here in the session, we will get to offline. So feel free to include your questions in the chat.
So I was just going to pick up a little bit on Nadia's observation about outside counsel and share some of my personal experience in that regard. At the end of the day, one of the important things for a GC is to have the outside counsel for the company be your partner. And how you accomplish that and the way in which you do that really depends on relationships. It depends on the boards. It depends on whether you are choosing outside counsel or you are inheriting outside counsel from others that you have when you started at the company, or even if you may be using a outside counsel that has a relationship with someone in the company who wouldn't be the one that you personally would have chosen. But at the end of the day, you have to look at the outside counsel in the company that advise the company as an important relationship. And not everybody can do this. In many of the companies I've worked at, we had a very strict rule that no one outside the legal department could speak to outside counsel directly unless it was arranged with or for the legal department. Now, you obviously can't impose that on board members in the same way if they're playing golf with another lawyer and just pick their brain. But at the end of the day, outside counsel are a really valuable resource. And if the board and if the executive team in the company understand that you are their best advisor because you understand the business and you are enmeshed in the business in a way that no outside counsel can possibly be, and that you will happily bring outside counsel in if it's an issue that you feel as a GC that the company needs outside advice on, or that the board or somebody else wants to get outside advice on, then you will also effectively end up in a position where they are not going to give conflicting advice. And if they do give conflicting advice, then they won't be your outside counsel for very long. And that's the most important thing. And so, I'm not going to, I can't account for people who decide to go do their own research. But if you have trusted outside counsel relationships, and that is also an opportunity for you to say, if the situation arises, that is an issue where my instinct says X, but I really want to do a little bit of research to confirm, or I want to check with outside counsel to confirm. And you can then position yourself as the gatekeeper and the expert on what outside counsel to call and how to manage the question and the advice in a way that reduces costs. Because ultimately, where the legal department can contribute financially to the company, even as overhead, is in managing outside counsel costs based on who you call, when, and where. And identifying a trusted partner who understands that is also crucial.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I love that. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. I see them coming in. we only have a couple of minutes to actually address the Q&A, so I'll just go through here. I see two questions actually on the same topic. What emerging or new skills do you think a future GC will need compared to an established GC today? There's another question, a couple down below that, around skills and tips for senior lawyers now in preparation for a GC role in the future. Yeah, I would like to offer my 2 cents on this, and maybe Stephanie and Nadia, you can add yours as well. From my perspective, I think it is around this concept that we talked about earlier in the polls with respect to being a commercial business leader, right? And this whole concept of you being in-house counsel and knowing your own business the best, trying to kind of see it as a consultant role, not just as a legal technical advisor. You know, someone who actually can speak the language of the business, and, you know, even just being able to find out which publications your fellow executives and your board are getting their information from, and being able to speak the language that is being spoken, not just again in that legalese, but in a space of being able to push the mission forward. Stephanie and then Nadia, your thoughts?
So I agree 100% with what Pam said, and that would absolutely be the first thing, which is to know the business. The other thing that I would add is that the difference between being a great lawyer and a great GC is actually the soft skills. It is the skills that do not always serve you well as a junior associate in a large law firm, or that you don't need, but it is the relationship building skills. It is the leadership skills. The legal department is often the only department in the company where someone is promoted for doing a good job and not for their skills as a manager. And I'm sure everybody on this call has worked for some great GCs in their career and some terrible ones, and knows the difference. And the differences really are the soft skills that make you a great leader, as well as a great partner and executive advisor. You are not just the lawyer when you're the general counsel. You are a member of the senior executive team of the company who has to exhibit the leadership skills and the relationship building skills that make any senior executive successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the soft skills are critical, and I think that if you, whether you're a GC or if you're in a team and you're sort of moving up through the internal ranks, you know, going out and almost sort of putting yourself out on a limb to go to some, I mean, I was very fortunate to work for organizations that had some very far-flung destinations, and you know, one of the best things I did was go and stay in a staff house near a drilling field and really understand, you know, how operationally that business works. And I think if you do that, you have conversations with people like the drilling engineers and the mechanical guys and the people who are so far removed from what you're actually doing in legal. I think that's how you grow and develop relationships. And I think being cognizant of the fact that sometimes, you know, I mean, I've heard people say so many times in businesses, oh, it's with legal, which means that sort of, you know, whatever the contract is has disappeared down some sort of black hole. And I think that if you have that sort of connection with the business and the connection with the employees who can just say, look, can I just come in and run this by you? Then that really is going to make your job sort of internally much more efficient. But also, I think personally, that's a much more fulfilling role to play, rather than just someone who's looking at a contract and signing off. That's not really what you're there to do. And I think the other thing is, if you have an opportunity to sit in a budget meeting and financial meetings, I was invited to those. I was very lucky. I didn't have to push for it, but I think you can see so much and learn so much just from looking at the way the business operates from a totally different perspective to the one that we're trained in. That was invaluable for me.
Thank you, Nadia. And we've run out of time, so I'll hand it back over now to Niamh to close us out.
Thanks, Pam. I want to say just 3 things to everybody. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone for attending today. The engagement along the way just made the conversation so much richer. So thank you for being a part of today's discussion. I want to say a big thank you to all our panelists for the time, thought and consideration they put into today's session. We have lots of sessions coming up. There's still time for you and your team to get involved over the coming months and beyond. And the final thing I would love to leave you with, if Natalie, we can go to the next slide. Earlier this year, you told us that you would love to have more access to content, practical tips like this at 24/7, when you want it, whenever you want it. We have a fantastic new offering available to you. I'm going to pop the link in the chat now, and we'd love your feedback on it. So you can access extra insights, tools, checklists, podcasts, and lots more practical tips like you've heard today when you need it on Centrex, which is our new on-demand content offering. We'd love to know, the final thing is we'd love to know what you thought of today's session. Pop us a note in the chat as you continue with the rest of the day. That concludes our session for today. Thank you all for joining us, and we're wishing you a great rest of day.